Lions Rock Productions.
This is Jay
This
Moore.
is Greg Proops.
This is Jordan Harbinger.
This is Dexter from The Offspring.
This is Nathan
This is
East.
Sebastian Younger.
This is Rick Marotta.
This is Stuart Copeland.
This is Mick Gillette.
This is Andy Summers.
Hi, this is Skunk Baxter.
This is Gabby Reese.
This is Rob Bell. Hey, this is John Leon Guerrero.
Hey, and this is Pete A. Turner.
Hey, this is Jerome Preisler, and you're watching the Break It Down Show.
And now, the Break It Down Show with John Leon Guerrero and Pete A. Turner.
Jerome's been on the show before, and if you look at so Jerome right now is in like one of the many storms of the century, and I guess they mean just any storm in the century is the storm of the century. But he's up in the Great Northeast, and so he's limited. So he's been gracious enough to hang in there with us and do this on the phone because he has no power in his house, and so we're doing this thing. He has written a book called Civil War Commando, and look. Jerome also wrote about the actual Dirty Dozen, who were really called the Dirty 13, Jack McNeese's crew in World War II. And then he found this other guy, William Cushing, and I read the book. And this thing, I'm telling you right now, if you like Civil War history, if you like action, actual people doing the actual actions, not made up stuff, you cannot go any further. This is how incredible Bill Cushing is. He got kicked out of, on the eve of his graduation from the Naval Academy, he got kicked out of the Naval Academy and ended up getting buried there at the end of his life with like full honors and a guy they celebrate at the Naval Academy. That's how much of a crazy dude this guy was. So, Jerome, thank you for coming on the show. Don, I'm going to come to you in a second. Thank you for coming on the show to co-host. Jerome, how did you find William Cushing, and thanks for doing this with us?
First of all, it's my pleasure. I always love being on the show. As to how I came about it, you know, you mentioned the book I wrote, the World War II book I wrote, which was called First to Jump, and that was about the pathfinders of the 101st Airborne. And one of the guys, and I know you've read and really liked the book. One of the guys that I wrote about in that book was a guy named Jake McNeese, and Jake was the founder or the head, not founder. He was the head of a group, a demolition group. That was the basis of the novel, The Dirty Dozen. They called themselves the Filthy 13, and they were probably crazier than the Dirty Dozen in some ways. After I wrote that book, I had really loved writing about this guy Jake McNeese. He was as he said, he was a lousy garrison soldier, but a great warrior, and that's what he was. Put him in the field, put him in combat, and you could bank on this guy. And I guess what I wanted to do was see if I could find a person who was similar but in a different era. Just primarily again because I had so much fun writing about McNeese. So I started poking around, and I knew nothing about Will Cushing at all. I just was looking on the internet. I had thought about writing something set in the Revolutionary War, and I checked into that a little bit, and I couldn't really find a topic that was right. Started poking around Civil War, which was another era that I'd never written about. I didn't know what I thought was enough to write about the Civil War. But then I hit on Cushing, and I don't remember exactly what website it was, but I just hit on his name and started reading some stuff. I think it was probably a local, some local North Carolina town website, and his name came up in one of his escapades, and I started reading about that one, and that one thing led to another, and that's how I got to Will. And it was amazing because my first thought was there has to have been, not just a book, but there have to have been many books written about this guy. And there had been, but none of them were recent, and none of them were really written in the kind of, exciting narrative style that I felt he deserved. In other words, his life was, more exciting and adventurous than any novel you could come up with. So it should have been written in a novelistic style, at least in my mind. But there was nothing like it. So that's really, that was the start of it.
I love it. Thanks for doing it. Hey, Don, you get to read. And one of the things I want to tell everybody too, and Don will appreciate this. One of the things Jerome does is he reads the letters. When you read the letters, you start to get the reality out. And there's so much detail in there. And I'm like, and I want to have Jerome talk about this in a moment. When does the novelist start and the historian stop? Because you can't fill in every hole, and you do such a great job of telling these stories. You've been in the letters, you understand this guy, but there is going to be some point where you're going to have to kind of extrapolate or make some assumptions. Hey, Don, when you hear this story about Bill Cushing, and I know you know about him, we talked about him before, but this is a guy that doesn't even win the Medal of Honor because his brother already has one anyhow. What do you think about this guy and his crazy, insane, this guy could not be killed in combat?
Yeah, this guy seemed to be bulletproof somehow. But his attack on the Confederate ironclad, Albemarle, is absolutely, I don't want to give away the story, but he is an absolute action hero and full of daring. And you see stories like this over and over again in the American Civil War. His is a great one to focus on. This book is great service. And the fact that the author has bothered to read the dead people's letters is important.
Well, in Will's case, the letters were great because Will, first of all, I don't know if I even mentioned it in the book, but I think I did. Will was writing a lot of these letters. Some were to his cousin Mary, who he was one of his close confidants and who he'd grown up with. And then a lot of them were written to his mother. And when he was writing to his mother, he really had in mind that he was hoping she would go to. He had another brother who worked at the local newspaper up in the town in upstate New York, where he'd spent most of his young life. And so he really wanted to impress everybody in town. So when he was writing these letters, he spared no grisly detail. And it's kind of funny in a way because he's writing to his mom and he's talking about, people's guts being, falling out and people getting their heads blown off. And of course, all of this is with this audience in mind. He's hoping that they're going to get published. And in fact, they were. I don't know if all of them were, and I don't know whether they cleaned them up any, but most of these letters were in fact published in the local town newspaper. So,
there's kind of a Victorian sensibility to it, then, huh?
Right, exactly. And he actually had a great style. And the thing for me really was, the letters gave me a real, and I think the book gave me a sense of his spirit and really imbue the book with that. I mean, you can feel this guy was someone who was almost, in my own mind, born out of time. He had the sensibility of a medieval knight. He was this gallant character. He wasn't particularly political. He was more about his own sense of his own inner compass as to in terms of what was right and wrong to him, which is how he got into trouble a lot. Because something was wrong to him, he wasn't going to do it, and it didn't matter if it was coming from a commanding officer. But just getting back to the letters for a minute, I think that what they enabled me to do as well was kind of set up a framework so that if I saw, if Will was writing about a particular action he was involved in, I could then, through the magic of the internet these days, and you got, um, in the last decade, Google has scanned in so many uh, military documents. I mean, you have all the after action reports, you have all of the contemporaneous histories that were written by the respective navies, the Confederate and Union navies. And then I was able to just also look at the contemporaneous newspaper accounts again, because you've got sources like newspaper.com and others. So you can actually, I could look at his letter and see what he'd written about. And then, if he'd exaggerated or not, I could find out. And I could also, I could match events up using action reports, using newspaper articles, and sometimes where he was vague, I could nail it. I could say, okay, this is where that happened. This was the inlet where this action took place. And sometimes if he, for example, didn't even know who was shooting at him, which was pretty typical. He didn't have satellite intelligence in those days. I could actually get into the Confederate post-action reports or Southern newspapers and find an article about uh, uh, a particular skirmish that took place on a particular day that Will had written about, and match them up and realize, okay, this was it, and the information would correspond perfectly. So I could really cross-index things. So but the letters were my framework and really helped me, just get a handle on who Will really was.
Yeah, there's an amazing amount of information on Civil War actions. Whenever I have students that are asking me what sort of history they should write on, I said, well, what are you interested in? So, oh man, I want to write about the Third Reich. I said, well, how's your German? Well, I don't read or speak German. I said, well, then I don't think I would write about the Third Reich. But the Civil War, there's a ton of stuff online. There's a ton of stuff published. That's really low-hanging fruit if you want to get some really nice documentation on like you're talking about. I'm fascinated by Mrs. Cushing. I mean, she's the mother of heroes, man.
She was, and she really led a difficult life. Obviously, having read the book, she was one of the things that I write about in this book is basically he had a pretty lousy father, and and a lot of it's interesting because a lot of the other stuff that had been written about him, all the information about his dad was really seemed to come from a single source, which was a family history written by some uncle. And as you look at these family histories, they were just that. And in those days, they weren't gonna say anything negative about anybody. So and so was always a good, hardworking person. This person was always great. Everybody got along. But that wasn't the case. And his father essentially abandoned his family, which was a big family. I forget how many siblings exactly, 5, 6 siblings. Left his mother in a Chicago rooming house when Will was 6 or 7 years old, I believe. Um, he was always in debt, always borrowing, and really left, you know, uh, saying that he was going. He had tuberculosis, and he was going to a relative's house to recuperate. Someone who lived in, I believe, near St. Louis, and he ends up just kind of disappearing. They don't hear from him. He finally turns up in a boarding house in Ohio, I believe, and he's near death, and he was addicted or borderline addicted to cough medicine, quote unquote, which in those days was opiates, and he really so he really again abandons his family, and here's this woman, and she's got all these kids. She moves up to her husband's hometown in northwestern New York, and really they're kind of like, although he does have some relatives who are pretty well to do, their family is sort of considered they're the the black sheep. They're the poor people in the family. They get help, but people are always telling his mom, "Why don't you put the kids up for adoption? It'll be a lot easier." And she's not going to do that. So she opens her own school. She makes very little money. Eventually, the boys get old enough so that they can work, and they're all doing, helping out at the local farms, milking cows. But she really, as you said, she was the mother of heroes. And there's one particular scene in the book, and I don't want to give everything away, but it's really interesting because Will Cushing's brother Alonzo, who's the hero that that we've been, that you alluded to a few minutes ago. He's killed at Gettysburg, and she loses one son, and then she finds out about a year later that Will comes to her before he's going to go on this mission to destroy this mighty ironclad, the Albemarle, and he tells his mother, although it's top secret, he gets her in a wagon and they go out to the mountains, and he tells her, look, I'm going off on this mission, and I probably won't return. And they pray together, and she sees him off, and she's living with the knowledge that she may, within the course of a year, lose yet a second son to the war. Yeah, it was it's real. I think it's really, I really am glad that you brought her up.
Well, and I think that it's interesting too that they went and prayed together, because clearly she had to have some kind of faith to sustain her through all that stuff. And when you're talking about Alonzo, he didn't just get killed at Gettysburg. He went down at the angle, at the high water mark, at Pickett's charge. He was manning his guns as the Rebs were coming up the slope. So he wasn't just a guy that got hit by a stray round somewhere on the other side of Culp's Hill. He was right there at the point of decision. And so somehow these guys from this family seem to be right smack dab in the eye of the storm wherever they go. And something in their upbringing made them somewhat fearless. But I think maybe you hit on it too. They did what they thought was right, and consequences be damned. And there's something in that bloodline. And
although Alonzo was the older brother, when they were growing up, Will was kind of the pack leader. And there's a story that I touch on in the book when they were going to the local school, and Will used to organize these. He used to basically was playing soldier, but he had this group of kids that he organized, and the whole idea was they would escape from school. They would escape from school, and they would jump the fence and go on launch commando style raids. I don't know who they were raiding. I guess probably the teachers or people in town. But at the same time, so Alonzo would follow Will on these escapades, and at the same time, another aspect of Will that we see early on is that he always stuck up for the weak kids in town, for the underdog, and he did that throughout his life. You saw that there was a pattern. As a young kid, one of his friends was very, very ill. I forget what ailment he had, but it probably was something like tuberculosis, and he was forbidden to go visit the kid in his house. And he sneaked out of his room, climbed up into his friend's window, and sat with him. He did the same thing, whatever it was, a decade and a half later, when he's a young seaman aboard a naval vessel, and one of his friends from back in the military, from back in the Naval Academy, falls down a hold and nearly gets killed, and Will refuses to leave him. He does that again later on in a different circumstance, and so you can just kind of see this you see that personality, and it was certainly there at an early age. And I think it was also the responsibility that these boys and young men took for for holding their family together.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, they had to help make ends meet, and siblings raised each other. I'm the youngest of 10 kids, so I understand what it means to have siblings that are all kind of interlocking fields of fire as you're being raised. So there's that sort of cohesiveness that's born of adversity that I think helped to perhaps shape this guy's personality.
Mm-hmm. Almost immediately when the book starts, and this doesn't ruin it for anybody, but you set the context for who Will Cushing is, and I don't recall the age, but in my head, he's like 3 years old and he's wearing his dad's top hat and he's walking down the pier. And he'll be damned if he's not going to get on that paddle ship that's already steamed away from the pier. He's just
Yeah, I
goes
think he was like
down and
4 or 5. Yeah.
yeah, and this intrepid kid is like, I'm going to get on that ship and go somewhere. And just by his dashing style, everybody's like, well, that kid's obviously going somewhere. We're going to let him go. And no one even stops this little kid. And then he just goes right off the end of the pier. There's no boat there anymore, by the way. It's gone.
But I always wondered, like, it's one thing when you're recreating the scene is there, there obviously there are all sorts of people on the docks. This is in Chicago, so you've got all of these, you've got warehouse people, you've got all these dock workers. They're loading wagons, and I'm thinking, does anybody notice this little kid with the top hat? But obviously, if they did, they didn't stop him from jumping in the water.
Probably placing bets on whether or not he'd do it.
Yeah. And this is sort of the guy he was. There's two things I want to bring up right now is he doesn't just go out and attack this ironclad and go on this impossible mission, but he does this a number of times. And again, this is in spite of being like, hey, you're no longer in the Navy at all. And then right then the Civil War breaks out. It's like, well, we need some people. All right, we'll kind of let you back in. And he just keeps going out and doing these impossible things. And as you said earlier, defying or denigrating not just senior officers, but extremely senior officers. He had no ability to hold his tongue.
Mm-hmm. And the thing was, he was too good. There was too much of a need for manpower, and he was too effective for them to do anything. Maybe if there had been less of a scramble for officers and sailors, maybe things would have been different. But I think that it was, they needed people, and here's this guy who, give him an inch and he'll burn down a mile of Confederate territory. And one thing I think is interesting in terms of the mission against the Albemarle and all the other missions that he undertook, is that to kind of put the whole, all of that in context, and really his rise through the Navy in that same context. The Civil War started in 1861, and right after, within months, Lincoln imposed the blockade against the South. And there's a lot of historical debate, but really, if you look at it, the blockade was not nearly as effective as they'd hoped for, and it was pretty. The reason for that was pretty simple. You had these large blockading vessels that were cooping off these harbors in deeper waters, and here you had the Confederate occupants of in the case, what I'm writing about in this book, North Carolina, Virginia, who are very, very familiar with those waters. They know all the inlets, they know all the sneaky ways in and out. So if they want to transport, whether it's cotton, whether it's gunpowder, whether it's guns, whether it's troops, they get a small blockade running vessel, and they're in and out, and they're doing it at night. And these big ships that are anchored off the coast can't do anything. They're not fast enough to pursue them. They're too big to really get close enough to shore. So there had to be a way around that. And it was really, you give a lot of credit to Will, but it was this guy who winds up being Will's mentor, this guy, Charles Flusser, who headed the Atlantic Blockade Squadron at one point. But it was this guy who really starts coming up with these lightning, what in a modern day, context we call Navy SEAL type raids, where they're using small vessels, they're going in and out, they're going ashore, or they're going into harbors with, maybe one boat with 13 or 14 men, or two boats, so there's 30 of them. And that worked. They could kind of they could fight on a level playing field, or even better than level, because they could now surprise the enemy. But they couldn't do that when they were just blockading. So Will really becomes kind of takes this, takes the reins of it after Flusser introduces him to this sort of tactic, and he just runs wild with it. He becomes this if this demonic figure who's just you know launching one successful mission after another.
The Albemarle was in a peculiar position. I mean, why have an ironclad where that one was located, and what was it doing?
Well, Roanoke, the Roanoke, Virginia, had been a kind of a commercial and a center of commerce and transport, and it had changed for both the North and the South, and it had changed hands a few times. And once it was occupied by the South late in the war, um, all the shipping lanes around there became closed to the north, and conversely became freely traversed by the South. So, uh, trying to make a long story short, what the CSS Albemarle is doing there is it is this huge monster that is guarding Roanoke, and it is cutting off any North Union access, and really this almost a monstrous wall sitting there.
And it keeps it open to blockade runners, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Interesting. I ran into an incident that was set in that part of the world. It's called the Maple Leaf Affair. Did you ever run across that in your research?
No.
Yeah, it's the story of a bunch of Confederate POWs that actually take over their prison boat that's taking them off to captivity at Fort Delaware, there near Norfolk, and they turn around and essentially beach the boat at the North Carolina Virginia state line and go bushwhacking through the Great Dismal Swamp, heading over towards Portsmouth, and making this great escape. And all these guys were from the Trans-Mississippi too, so these are Louisianans and Texans and all sorts of folks like that. But you're right, that whole part of the Eastern Seaboard is a very, very interesting theater of the war that a lot of people don't really pay much attention to.
Yeah, that was another thing when I was actually putting together my proposal before, and trying to sell the book. Uh, um, one of the things there's that publishers like to see is what they call a list of comparative titles. So
Yeah.
so you can say, well, my book's like this, but it's not like that, like it, and that's they hand that over to their sales and marketing guys. And when you start really when I remember, very clearly when I started doing it, putting together my proposal, you couldn't really find a lot of books on naval action in the Civil War,
Yeah.
and so a lot of people really don't know about it. And the other aspect, which since you mentioned it, is if you look at a map of the if people aren't familiar with the Carolinas or parts of Virginia, if you look at a map of the coast there, it's really it's just very craggy, and it's in World War II, it's different environment, different, it was a lot colder. But if you look at the Norwegian coast, which I'd written about at one time, very similar, where they had all the fords in Norway, and here you've got just endless. It's just all of these interconnected streams and rivers and inlets and bays, and it's just this aquatic maze. And again, the Confederates they had people who had grown up in those areas, so they knew them. They knew them inside out, and the Northerners didn't, which gave
One of
the
the
South
things that
obviously.
struck me is interesting as you illustrated that exact thing was the seamanship required to take these different sized boats that weren't purpose built. I mean, it's kind of old timey, it's super old timey looking because it is old timey, but
Yeah,
side wheel paddle boats, this kind of sailboats, like these aren't what we think of as a navy, and having to plan on a tide to get you off of a sandbar to move you in. I
yeah.
mean, this stuff is insane. Before we talk more about that, let me quickly say this. Um, I love having Don on the show because Don runs the Texas Center at Schreiner University, and he's the lead historian for the whole Texas Center thing. So I want Don to briefly talk about that. And then also, it's my birthday to everybody, and I'm just celebrating that. And also, we
Hey,
put my yeah, it's good. It's a lot of good and bad. And then we laid my brother to rest this past weekend, and so if you guys
oh,
are interested in helping those guys out, go
oh,
to the GoFundMe page. I'll put a link up here on the show. Their family still needs some help. And then the other thing I wanted to say is it's just great to be able to do this show, and I love you guys all doing it. If you could subscribe, that would help me. Briefly, Don, would you talk about the Texas Center real quick? Oh, I don't wanted to say one more thing. I promised Julie Taylor a shout out because I love her. She loves Huey Lewis in the News. We're trying to work on getting Huey on the show. I don't want to forget to say hi to Julie. Uh, Don, would you talk about the Texas Center real quick?
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to break up the flow of what we're doing, but yeah, the Texas Center at Schreiner University in Kerrville, Texas, is really talking about the big conversations facing the Lone Star State these days, and there's a lot of action going on down here. It's a booming place. A lot of people moving to Texas, and as a result, Texas is probably going to double its population by 2050,
Wow.
which will eclipse places like California, and all of a sudden make Texas a very, very important place, even more important, outsized important place in terms of U.S. politics and economics and things like that. And so there is we've got to plan for this future, and that's what the Texas Center is doing, talking a lot about Texas history, but also how that history informs the present and how the present gets ready for the future. So that's what I've been spending my days doing.
Jerome, let's get back to Civil War Commando. I'm interested. Will Cushing is so impactful. I mean, one of the things about the North, and I'm not the historian here in the room. I'm going to let Don correct me if I get wrong, but they have so much stuff compared to the South. And every time you can attack someone's capacity or their stuff and they're limited on that, that's got to have a huge, if nothing else, it requires a lot of people, a lot more people to be in a lot more shoreline to prevent someone like Will from basically walking in and breaking and stealing your shit. So, how impactful is a guy like Will Cushing in the war, do you think? I mean, I know there are singular guys, but he sure seems like one.
well, I think in wars, of course, there's a political element to what's going on. There's questions of morale, both within the obviously the troops and the civilian population. And if you look at what was going on, especially as Will is about to take on the Albemarle, that was in fall of 1864. So really, nearing the end of the war. And obviously there'd been tremendous hardship and casualties, and Confederate troops were really bogged down in different places, um, not making a lot of headway. There hadn't been a lot of progress in the war, so I think there was kind of a twofold um, importance to Will's most famous and most important mission, and that was one was the morale boost it gave, uh, both to civilians and the troops, and the other was obviously the tactical and strategic importance of it. And I don't really know. I can't really say which was more important. If you're going to put me on the spot, which you really didn't, so I'll put myself on the spot. I would say it was really the morale boost that it gave the troops and gave the North. It was a big story in the newspapers. It gave Lincoln a boost when there were a lot of cries for him to kind of just to end the war prematurely. And I think that given the political situation at the time, I think there was a far greater importance in that regard than even in terms of the actual military aspect of it. However, the tactics that he employed were so new and so different that they, at the very least, inspired, tactics used by the Leathernecks and Marines in the 1950s in Korea, and obviously subsequently the Navy SEALs. Is there a direct thread again? I don't know that there is, but I think that overall, his impact is unquestionable.
Yeah, the interesting thing about the Confederate Navy too is that they were really dependent upon secret weapon sort of ships. So that was the whole idea behind these casemate ironclads like the Albemarle. And what they would do is they would make great big iron casemates and then put really very few but very powerful guns in them. And the idea was that they were potential blockade breakers because the Union Navy couldn't really scratch the paint very well with the state of the art of the artillery at the time. And that was really pointed out very clearly up at Virginia, the CSS Virginia, when it destroyed the Congress and the Cumberland up at Hampton Roads. Now, wasn't Cushing involved in that little fiasco?
Yeah, he was at the time. He was he actually was serving on one of the larger vessels that was involved in it, and he played a fairly minor role. But yeah, he was there. I think he was manning a cannon then, and there was nothing significant that he did. This was actually before he started making a name for himself, and in fact, before one of the times he got kicked out of the Navy. But yeah, he was there during that whole battle.
So he was looking over the rail at this big ironclad that was making very short work of two essentially first-rate warships. And by all accounts, I mean, the next day, the Virginia was going to finish off the rest of the Union warships and then open up Norfolk to commerce, to certainly blockade runners. But the Monitor, USS Monitor, shows up and fights it to a draw. So the idea behind these Confederate ironclads is that you have limited resources, so you put all your eggs in these ironclad baskets, and you hope that they can, make some sort of impact on the war. But they were always just chronically short of machinery. You never could find a steam engine that could push that kind of metal through the water. And so if you lost an ironclad, not only did you lose big, expensive, and rare guns, but you lost the machinery that went with it. And the Rebs couldn't make them ironclad all the way down to the keel, so they were ironclad from the waterline up, but beneath the waterline, it was a different story.
Mm-hmm. And another thing along, just to follow up on what you're saying, the iron itself was scarce because it was being used. They needed it primarily for the railroads, and so even when they were building the Albemarle, they were looking at old. They were trying to pull together railroad ties. They were using scrap metal. They were using anything they could get that they could melt down and use for the armor. So even the actual material was scarce.
Yeah, rolling iron plate was you could only do it about two different places in the American South. The most famous being the Tredegar Ironworks up in Richmond. But there was not a single mile of railroad laid in the American South that wasn't pulled up from some other place. I mean, they were just not making rails. They were having to roll iron if they could to make these ironclads. And so the loss of the Albemarle was a big, it was an irreplaceable loss, as it turns out. But do you want to go on to tell about how they sank this monster, or do you not want to give that up?
Well, I won't give. What I'll say is this: is that one of the things you just said is really important, and that is that obviously the armor could only go down to the keel, and then below that it was wood, and that was an Achilles heel. But the question was, how do you get to it? And that was really the determining factor in working out some sort of way to get in close enough to destroy one of these things, to get to its soft spot. And I don't know how much I want to give away, but I will say this: at one point, when Will comes up with the plan, and he kind of bounces it back and forth with some naval superiors who pretty much call him in and say, do you think you can do this? And he says, well, give me some time. And he comes up with a plan, and they go, okay, they approve it. And he ends up going to the Brooklyn Navy Yard in New York, and he introduces himself to a guy who's named William Willis Wiley Wood, and
Wiley Coyote, genius.
and Mr. Wood is this kind of when I was talking, Peter and I had spoken a couple of weeks ago, and I kind of compared him to the Mickey Rourke character in the old movie Body Heat, who's this kind of he's this wild scientist, or who's coming up with all these different uh, contraptions to hopefully that can be used for the Navy and the Army. And there he is in his office, and Will walks in, and he sees this guy, and his hair's all over the guy's hair's all over the place. And here's this Will walks in, and Will is probably in his 20s at the time, mid 20s, and he says, I'm gonna, here's my plan to destroy the ironclad. Can you devise this contraption for me? And the guy looks at Will's plans, and Will starts drawing things out for him, and the guy starts doing his own drawings, and before you know it, the two of them are in the Bay of New York, trying this out. And again, I don't know if I want to. I probably won't get into it here, but it's just really, to me, it's fascinating, it's funny, and it's just kind of wild to just picture these two guys on these little boats trying out these devices that they're going to use in this for lack of a better term, commando raid against this huge ironclad.
But there was a reason he told his mom, goodbye. I'm probably not coming back. Because what they came up with was pretty dangerous.
Yeah, and he really doesn't know if he's assuming it's going to be a suicide mission. He does go up against it in two small boats. I think there was 13 men on each boat. One thing I will say is that everything on the boat was rigged. These were little picket boats. They were probably 30 feet long. They were just rigged up with, they had one gun, and then they had this other secret weapon. And the gun was just rigged to it. They weren't built as warships. And to kind of, if give you everyone a point of comparison, the Albemarle was, I think, 156 feet long. Again, completely covered in iron plates. And one thing that's, I think, important to mention is, again, as you mentioned, Don, although it did have guns, one of the things that it used, what it really was, it was called a ram, and it's self-explanatory. The front of it was like a giant metal tusk, and its primary way of attacking enemy wooden ships was to ram them, and it would just go right through them. It would just tear through these vessels, and break them in half. So for 13 men to go up again, actually 26, two ships, two small boats worth of men to go up against this large ship is pretty incredible. It was done at night, and it was done in enemy territory, in the enemy harbor.
Yeah, it's pretty remarkable. I mean, I don't want to spoil it, but you're talking about during a war with reach from both shores, you're going to sail in and take on something that is not just well protected, but dear to this service. And the last thing that you want is for it to be sunk. And your job is to take these little tiny boats and go in there and sink it. I mean, this is not a warship, as Jerome was saying. It's a
And
crazy.
as they're going
Yeah.
in, the troops the troops on either the Confederate troops on either side of this harbor are signaling each other that something's happening. So they're all lighting these bonfires. So you can imagine it's a cold, rain swept night in October. They actually had to scuttle the mission. I believe it was either the night before or 2 nights before, because of the weather. And it didn't really improve that much, but it was enough for them to be able to go in, and at least for Will to be able to go in his estimate. And so they're going in this narrow waterway, and as they're going, dogs start barking. You know, big flames start erupting on either shore, and they're going in, undeterred.
Yeah. Yeah, you're coming. They know you're coming.
Yeah.
That's what you're
What?
sailing into.
There were Confederate guards on the deck of the ironclad, were there not?
Oh yes, yeah. In fact, there were. They were being fired at as they're approaching the ironclad.
Wow.
This is standard fare for Will Cushing. I mean, this is not this raid, but a lot of the raids, just by doing it, by putting his hat on and walking down the damn dock, like, well, that guy's not surely going to attack us, and all of a sudden there's the attack. It's over, and just he had elan and audacity in spades.
One little story that I didn't mention in the book because there was really no place for it, is that Will had several brothers, and we were talking about Alonzo, but there was also another brother who served in the army during the war, and he was friends with, and I'm trying to get this straight. One of this other brother's buddies was a close friend of Edgar Rice Burroughs.
Huh.
Edgar, and for those who don't know who he was, he's most famous for having created Tarzan, but he also is famous for creating a very early science fiction series called it starred a hero named John Carter of Mars, and there were a whole bunch of these John Carter of Mars books. Well, so Will's brother would tell his friend about Will's escapade. Later on, would talk to his friend about his adventures, and told him what happened when he went up against the ironclad. And there was this historian in Wisconsin who kind of put things together. And George Lucas, now we jump ahead of just a couple of years, George Lucas had cited those John Carter of Mars stories as inspiration for Star Wars. And of course, in Star Wars, you have Luke Skywalker attacking the Death Star, which is this giant Leviathan, this metal, behemoth in space. And if you look at those missions, they're really, really similar. So there was this guy in Wisconsin who who wrote this article, who conjectured that Will's mission was inspiration many generations later for Star Wars. And it seems extremely plausible to me because the stories are so similar. Obviously, he's not flying a spaceship, but you can really see you can see the parallels.
Interesting. We've got a similar experience here in the state. Robert E. Howard, who wrote the Conan the Barbarian series, grew up in a little town called Cross Plains, and essentially created this entire fantasy world based on what he knew about roughnecks and oil field workers and things like that. So,
Yeah,
you
I'm a
never
huge
know
fan
how
of Howard
these
as
things
well,
will
by the
end
way.
up maturing through time.
Yeah, Howard was great. The first books I read, one of the first I can remember the first paperbacks that I bought, and the first or second paperback I bought was one of the uh, Robert E. How the Conan books that were being reissued. They first came out in the 50s, and then they were being reissued in the 60s. And in those days, you could get a paperback for about 60 cents, something like that, 60 cents. So I get my dollar from my parents and my grandmother, and I'd walk to the local card shop, and they'd have a rack, and there was Robert E. Howard's Conan. And I thought, what the heck is this? I'd never seen anything like what you saw on the cover. So I became this huge Conan fan to this day.
Well, that's cool. Well, you got a little Texas influence there.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Hey, Jerome, I always love to ask this question. I know we just talked about the story that didn't fit in. What was some of the stuff that didn't fit into the stories in the letters? You know, the love interest, the other stuff where you're like, that won't work in this, but a little more what makes the man the actual non-warrior man.
I tell you the truth. I really feel I got almost everything into this. The only thing that the one thing I didn't do was I made a decision early on that I was only going to write about Will essentially until the mission against the Albemarle. And in fact, although he wasn't involved in any, really, daredevil escapades afterward, and then he had some interesting stories. Um, Post Civil War, he became sort of a naval ambassador to different countries. He married. I mean that doesn't sound too exciting, but it was just a lot of little things about his life afterward that I thought were kind of interesting, but just didn't. They were so anticlimactic that they really would have. It seemed to me best to sort of end the book with that mission and then kind of summarize what happened to him later. But other than that, I was really able to get uh, really all the good stuff in. In fact, a lot of the battles the fight that he was involved in, leading up to the Albemarle mission, really weren't written about a lot before. And I kind of agonized when I was writing them about, what do should I leave this in? Should I leave it out? And in the end, there were very few that I left out, and it was kind of hard to squeeze it all into a 90,000 word manuscript. But there isn't much. There really isn't much that's not in there.
He dies remarkably young, doesn't he?
Yeah, he was only in his 30s when he died, and he actually was not of sound mind at the time. There's there's no conclusive diagnosis as to what was wrong with him, but he was really never healthy after the Albemarle raid. And again, I'm not going to give away everything that happens, but he's injured uh, in, um, in that attack,
Hmm.
and whether he suffered concussion, uh, we don't know. But he for years afterward he had terrible headaches. Eventually he had very, very early dementia. I mean, early. He was in his 30s, and I'm not positive, but I think he was about 36 when he died. So
That's
yeah, he
back
died.
trouble too, right?
Yeah, he had back trouble, and all of these things could really be, very likely traced back to what happened to him in that mission. But we don't know.
Yeah.
We don't know.
Reminds me of somebody like JFK and PT 109. He ends up
Right.
suffering a debilitating wound that he has to carry with him all the way to his early death.
Yeah, exactly.
When you look at, so just in general, Jerome writes a lot of this is kind of funny, Don. You'll appreciate this. Writing books like this is sort of Jerome's hobby because his regular job is writing, like for the Tom Clancy franchises, and those people expect him to constantly be cranking out books. And so I'm not exaggerating when I say that this is what Jerome does in his spare time. He fights these incredible stories and he writes them. And I love Jerome's work. And you guys, seriously, first to jump, if you think you know about World War II history and you think like, hey, the paratroopers jumped in, how about the guys that jumped in before? And the story that we talked about the last time we were on, Jerome, when they jump
Yeah.
into the Battle of the Bulge, and they tell Jack McNeese, Don, I don't know if you know this, they tell Jack McNeese is trying desperately to get in and bring aid into these, the guys at the Battle of the Bulge.
It was
Say,
the
hey,
guy. It
bring
was
Black
actually
Smoke. Yeah,
It was when Bastogne was surrounded.
Bastogne, right?
Yeah.
And so he's like, yeah, bring Black Smoke if we're not going to do it, and bring Orange if we are. And Jack tells all his boys, or Jake tells all his boys, you're only bringing Orange Smoke. This is happening, and just I love these stories, Jerome.
He tells
What's
his
next
commanding
for you?
officers that again, if there's this massive airlift that's coming in, and we have I think it's 14,000 troops that are surrounded by what was it? What was the German numbers? Was it like 40,000? With I don't know how many tanks and guns, and they've surrounded the city of Bastogne, and it's in the middle of the winter, and our troops they've run out of everything. They have no more ammunition. They've got no medicine. They've nothing. They're freezing to death. They're starving. They're sick. They don't have bullets to put in their guns. So there's this airlift that's planned, but again, the the German tanks have actually moved into within yards of where some of our soldiers are encamped, so if you picture a donut, Jake McNeese and his guys, and this is one stick of men. This is like 8 men. They have to jump into the middle of this donut, and there's heavy cloud cover. There's awful weather. This happens in December, right before day before Christmas, I think. And Jake tells as Pete was just saying, Jake tells his superiors, yeah, if I set off the black smoke, it means the airlift's off. It's too dangerous. And he jumps down, and there's literally a German tank, 30 yards away from him. So he's looking up the barrel of this gun, and again, he doesn't even have any black smoke with him. He's, you know, he's just setting off the orange. And orange, by the way, the reason they were using orange was because that was the color of the Netherlands, of the Free Netherlands. So that was why they chose orange.
So you like do or die stories?
Oh, I love them, yeah. And also, I like my kind of stories is do or die, and basically guys who are written off who who end up doing the job.
Yeah.
And I just I have an affinity for those stories.
Yeah, yeah.
In
I
part
love
because
it.
I was written off, and I try to do the job, so I can relate.
Well, you do a good job. I mean, First to Jump just is such an incredible book. Civil War Commando, just as good. I love reading it. What's next for you, Jerome?
Well, right now I'm you just mentioned I'm writing I relaunched a series that was co-created by Tom Clancy back in the 90s called Net Force, and uh, I started doing that in 2019, and that is really more than full time. I'm doing initially 4 books, one a year, and in between I'm doing these novellas, which are short novels, also in the series. They're all in the chronology, so it's essentially, and a short novel to me is like, you know, 2 sentences shorter than the actual novel, because I'm incapable of writing anything that's short. So I end up writing 8 novels in 4 years. So I'm pretty much in the middle of that run, and right now I'm writing book 4 in the series. I've written 3 of the novels and 2 of the novellas since 2019.
Wow.
Yeah. It's
Page a day is a book a year, as they say.
Yeah. When people talk about being in lockdown, it was nothing. And to me, I've been in lockdown for years.
yeah, you call that working.
Yeah, no,
Hey,
exactly,
Don,
no sweat.
anything in closing, Don?
No, I'm fascinated by this man of letters that you've introduced me to today. This is pretty remarkable, and I like all the tales of daring do. So I'm looking forward to seeing what else comes out of his facile pen.
Yes. And Jerome, anything in closing?
No, it's just great to be here, despite my sitting here in the gathering dusk in Maine. It's been a lot of fun to be on the phone with you guys.
Yeah. Thank you so much for doing that. All right, stand by for 1 sec, fellas.